Yeah, and you've basically said this, but I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't spell it out. It's just funny that he's calling out racism against whites by being racist towards blacks. Like you're not solving anything by doing the exact same thing that you're taking issue with. Hello, and welcome to Awake at the Wheel. So in today's episode, we're going to be exploring some of the work of Scott Adams. So many would have initially known him for his work with Dilbert. I remember looking at Dilbert comics as a small child and thinking they were painfully boring because it was about some dude in an office who hated his job. So that's the extent of my knowledge of Dilbert. But beyond that, he's getting a lot of notoriety these days because he's been speaking up a lot about some of the injustices that whites are experiencing as far as this focus on race in the world in general, on social media, and so on. So we're going to start out by just having a little bit of a discussion here about it, and then watch a video that brought about quite a significant, I was surprised at the significant reaction that I had to it because it made me quite angry, but I think it's a good starting point for us to chat about. But Oren, what do you want to say about Scott Adams before we jump in?
Okay, so I've been watching Scott Adams daily, when I work out or do other stuff for the last number of years, at least 3 or 4 years, I believe. I cite him in class. I tell my patients about him, and I used to enjoy his comic, Dilbert, when I was older when I was reading it, so I appreciated it. And it's almost it's the Howard Stern effect. Okay, I'm watching him because I dislike some of the stuff he says so much. I dislike him so much. I can't help but listen to it. Okay, and that's how Howard Stern got so popular, right? People want to hear what's he going to say next, right? But so I'm going to get the bad parts out of the way first, because I want people to understand I'm not a sycophant. I know exactly what he's doing. I have commented on many of his videos negatively. And I think maybe the first one, I'm not sure if it's the very first, but a number of years ago, it was around Christmas time, I think 2 or 3 Christmases ago, where he basically stated in his usual, let's say, arrogant manner, and I'm going to say narcissistic. Now, I'm not diagnosing him, but the reason I'm saying narcissistic, because he declared that narcissism was not a thing. He said there's no such thing as narcissistic personality disorder, and he's going on and on. And I think it's because, many people were calling Trump a narcissist, and he has stated his affinity for Trump many, many, many times. He got notoriety later in his career in 2016 by being one of the first people, aside from Ann Coulter, to predict that Trump would win the election early on. Very early on. And he explained exactly why he said that, because he was talking about the persuasive techniques of Trump's. And at the beginning, when I'd hear him say, this is what Trump did, here's what he's saying, and here's the brilliance behind it, I was thinking, now I'm not diagnosing from afar, but I was thinking, and I was saying that can be easily and equally explained by someone who has who's a narcissist. A narcissist would do exactly the same thing that Trump was doing. Somehow, Trump parlayed it into success in many ways. I think it's more a result of the fact that the people that he was opposing aren't that bright. Okay, like truly, because if anyone had half any kind of intelligence, they would have been able to take all the stuff that he said and did, not get lured in. They would have been able to use it to highlight Trump's foibles. Okay. So to me, again, it wasn't some 4D chess that Trump was playing. These were the words and actions of a narcissist. Once again, I'm not diagnosing him, but that's how I saw it. And I'll explain that. Okay. So anyway, so around Christmas time, he declares it's not a thing, because he thought narcissism was just having confidence, believing in yourself, being a leader. Okay. And then he actually did some reading on it. And a few weeks later, he did a mea culpa. He said, oh my God, I had no idea. There's people like that. And then there's the actual narcissistic personality disorder. So he did admit that he got that wrong. However, in his usual Scott Adams fashion, his narcissistic fashion, I say again, narcissism, because he declares himself a narcissist, He proudly declares himself a narcissist because he didn't understand what he had actually investigated, because he breaks it down. And I know a lot of people go on the internet and they read about the grandiose versus or there's overt and covert, or the grandiose versus the vulnerable narcissist. and I can't remember if we talked about this in a previous podcast, but it pisses me off when they call grandiose versus vulnerable, because all narcissists are vulnerable. If you actually understand what narcissism is, it's all about vulnerability and trying to protect and trying to avoid, the reality of who you really are. Okay. But anyway, so he believed that grandiose narcissists are actually good people who want to do good for the world. Yes, they have too high self-esteem. Yes, they're hyperbolic. Yes, they can, be overly extroverted and whatever, but they are the ones who just want to do good for the world and they want to get recognition for it. Okay.
I just have to jump in because it drives me nuts. We've talked about this before, that everyone thinks that they're an expert on these things, but who the hell is he to comment on these things? He has as far as I know, no educational background that would support him making such broad statements about a disorder that he clearly doesn't understand. But here we are. But anyways, go on.
Well, that's what's so enraging for a lot of people. And he actually used that as calls it as like a superpower, that I don't have to be an expert on certain topics, whether it's climate change, economics, or whatever. Wow. He says, I use a filter. He uses a certain filter. And he always talks about how he's a hypnotist. He's a trained hypnotist, for many years. And he says that he's, an expert in persuasiveness, or persuasion. And so he says he uses a certain filter and he's able to analyze claims that he sees in the media through this filter. And he claims, more often than not, he gets it right. Okay. And he will always say, I'm the first person who said this, or, no one else told you this, or I've got the perfect track record on predictions, etc. Okay. Very hyperbolic. He claims that he will acknowledge his mistakes and everything, and he will acknowledge a few of them. Okay. But he always spins it in a way that makes him look pretty good. All right. So like a narcissist. But the point is, by the way, if anyone's wondering, the kind of narcissism that he's talking about, if anything, would be altruistic narcissism. The person who seems to be doing good for others, but it's unlike most people, the motives that they get, their motives and their intentions are different when they are doing these supposedly good things. But anyway, a little side note there, but he always talks about that and he brags about being a grandiose narcissist. So I can say he's a narcissist because I'm using his own words. So that's one of the problems. The other problem, and this is huge, is let me say the strength and the problem. One of his talents is he frames things in a certain way. And I know we're going to either do it in this podcast or in another podcast. Some of his framing, it really is, let's say, impactful. I appreciate it. And he talks about, and he has a whole book on, I think it's called How to Reframe Your Brain. I haven't read it, but he says there's like maybe 100 and some odd reframes that he admits, look, he says maybe 5% of people or 10% are going to read it and it's going to go, wow, it's going to click. It's going to resonate and it's going to help them see things differently. Like he says, reframing alcohol as poison. Okay. And that's one of his examples. So he talks about, and I hear him in his podcast where he frames things in ways where I go, wow, that's actually pretty clever. Okay. Or it resonates, or it will help people, and motivate themselves to do something better. So that's a positive. The negative of it is, and this is where he's persuasive for people who don't know what he's doing, but when he's framing things in a certain way, and he says it with such confidence and such, he's very compelling when he says it. Okay, it actually makes a lot of sense, and it's a great explanation if you don't include all these alternative explanations or alternative factors, right? It's a very narrow or a myopic way of looking at things. Not always, but many times. And a lot of his listeners, again, they're getting caught up in it and everything, and they're hearing what he says. It makes sense, but they're ignoring all the other stuff that would give a totally different perspective on what he's claiming.
And that seems so disingenuous and unethical, because I guarantee he knows that he's doing that. And if you sprinkle in some good stuff that's, true and helpful, then people are going to be more likely to believe the crap that he's putting out there too, or the half-truths or whatever.
Right. And it's, and a funny thing is sometimes he's even saying what he's doing. Okay. So it's like a good magician. Like when they're saying, here's what I'm doing, like Penn and Teller used to do that. It was still entertaining, right? Yeah. But they're explaining what they're doing. But other times he's not. Right. So if he's giving the illusion of I'm always explaining what I'm doing, therefore you can trust me, while not always explaining it, and he's actually still doing it, then it's very easy to pull the wool over people's eyes. And, again, I will comment on his videos about that. He's never responded to me. But again, that's why I say, I tell my patients, I say, if you ever watch him, I say, I don't know how anyone watches him live. He is the slowest speaker ever. I listen to him on 2 times speed and it's still too slow. Okay. I listen to most people on 1.5 to 2. With him, I want to be 4 times speed, and I could maybe tolerate it, but I don't know how they can listen to him on regular speed. So there are a lot of flaws. So I want to be very clear on this. Right. And the other thing is, and we'll talk about this when you bring up the video All right. Another thing he does, and it is very disingenuous, well, it's just outright deceitful. It's not even disingenuous. It's outright deceitful and manipulative, is that he'll say something. Either he'll say it in a way that it's like cold readers, which is, I'll make a statement that's vague and ambiguous enough that, that when it comes true, I can go, you see, I said it. However, what I said could have played out in his point, in trajectory A, B, or C, because it was vague and ambiguous enough. So I can claim yes, yes, or yes, I called it. Okay. Or he'll say something and you'll get called out on it. And then afterwards, he'll say, well, here's what I was doing. So he's rationalizing after the fact, okay, and trying to, make an argument for why what he said was not so bad. And again, we'll talk about this. And he says, well, I meant to do it this, I meant to do this, what you just saw. And again, that just sounds like a narcissist trying to justify. And again, I'm saying he calls himself a narcissist. Mm-hmm. So I'm not, okay, but it's trying to justify things after the fact, which again, for some people, especially if you find him persuasive, especially if you like him, you will gloss over all the other facts and say that makes sense. But for others who are more critical thinkers, we go, no, wait a second, that doesn't really hold water. Now, the thing is, final point is, so many of his haters, they do either take him out of context, or they don't understand the point. Okay, or they're just being totally irrational, and they do have maybe Trump derangement syndrome. So he's forever intertwined with Trump for supporting him and being a fan of his. And so and anything he says, they just can't register, and they're being totally irrational. So I want to be clear here. That's why I said it. I think he has a lot of good points. I think he can be very helpful. Some of his frames are amazing, or his reframes. I really like them, which is why I do recommend his videos or his podcast to my patients and students. I say, don't buy into it wholesale. Look at it, and maybe 50%, 70, 80, whatever. You'll say, that actually has some value. All right. Or maybe only 5%. But anyway, the point is, I'm not one of his haters, and I'm not one of his sycophants. I'm someone who can call both sides. I just wanted to put that all out there. So I know there's a long thing here, but I just don't want people accusing me of being one or the other. So there.
And to that point, that is why I was so surprised at the reaction I had to this video that we're about to watch. I actually read an article about it. Because usually I'm somewhere in the middle. I don't jump to conclusions. And I do, in many contexts, believe that white people are being shit on. So I agree with the sentiments of a lot of what he's saying. But the way in which this is being spun, I feel, is not telling the whole story, and is pumping out a certain narrative that he's trying to, and trying to maybe manipulate people into following what he's saying. But let's stop talking about the video and let's watch the video, and then we can talk some more about it.
Okay.
So if nearly half of all blacks are not okay with white people, according to this poll, not according to me, according to this poll, that's a hate group. That's a hate group. And I don't want to have anything to do with them. And I would say, based on the current way things are going, the best advice I would give to white people is to get the hell away from black people, because there's no fixing this. This can't be fixed.
So, listeners can clearly garner why I took issue with that, but I'm just pulling up some additional information here about what that poll is that he was referring to. So first of all, it was a poll of a limited number of people. It was not representative of all Black people. So let's, get that out of the way first. So this was from, let's see here. So the poll indicated that 53% of Black Americans who were polled agreed with the statement that it's okay to be white. I've recently learned that this "it's okay to be white" statement is often likened to All Lives Matter, which has become some sort of intertwined with hate speech or creating some sort of narrative or promoting some sort of narrative. But I wonder if the people who were polled actually know that. But point being, there's many layers to this poll that he's referencing that he completely oversimplified in that statement.
Okay, so now, when he was saying this, he had been talking prior to this video about trying to get himself canceled. Okay, or he's threatening to, and he wanted to bring a lot of attention to himself, and he said, by the way, he says after in his always hyperbolic statement, He said, not one black person disagreed with me, or sorry, not one black conservative disagreed with me. Okay. And he says that anytime I explain this to anybody, they all completely agree with what I said. And I've heard some of his interviews, and not everybody agrees completely with what he said. I've seen many black people say, no, I've heard your explanation, but I don't buy it. Now, if I were black, I don't know if I would be able to, understand what he's really doing. And, I don't know if I'd give him the benefit of the doubt afterwards, right? Because it does sound like a really horrific statement. Okay. But having followed him for the months up to that and subsequently, his explanations and everything, to me, I know what he was doing. I do believe what he was doing, but I think the way that he did it was just so terrible. Okay. And he got attention. Great. That's what he was trying to do. But there could have been different ways to get attention. And he understands, even though he's not an expert on it, he does understand to some degree human psychology. And once something's in the narrative, once people say, oh my God, he said that, black people are hateful or they're a hate group and whites shouldn't, be with them and everything like that. Once that's out there, it's really hard to undo. And he knows that. Right. So, there's different ways that he could have been provocative and got the same message across, which we'll talk about what the actual message was. Okay. But again, I've just seen him enough that I can give him the benefit of the doubt of what he was trying to do, because he's been very consistent in it. But again, terrible execution. And I think subsequently he has been saying that he knows that he kind of like misjudged how he played it out. Okay. Like, how he presented it.
So as far as, what you're saying in terms of, what he was trying to do, can you elaborate on what it was that he was trying to do? Because I don't know a whole lot about Scott Adams and his goal and his mission and so on. And even this specific issue of it's okay to be white. I guess that there's some implication of a history in white supremacy, and it's not a good thing for people to say. So with that in mind, what is he trying to do?
Okay, well, the statement of, again, it's okay to be white. I don't think he was definitely not factoring in the 4chan, usage of it, of trying to troll people and everything, or trying to make it a hateful statement. It wasn't that. He was taking it, and I can't remember if afterwards whether he has revised his position on it. Okay, but he was saying that literally almost half of black people, thought that it was not okay to be white. Now, actually, I know that he's heard other people saying there's more nuance to it, and there were other. It wasn't that they actually were saying that. Some were saying, "Well, I don't know," and the majority actually said that it is okay. All right. So anyway, I can't remember initially when he started with that. Okay, if he understood the question itself and the actual implications. Okay, but what he's trying to do, the main point was, and he's been saying this again for a very long time. Okay, he's been talking about how the media, the schools, and the government for many years have been stoking, interracial division and suspicion, mistrust, and hatred between all, again, different racial groups. And he's been calling that out frequently. And, kudos to him for doing that. I've been doing the same thing, right? Certain narratives have been promulgated within those different groups I just mentioned, or those systems that are, really making people not trust each other. And so what he said was, and he said this afterwards, like the very next day, if he might have even said in the same clip, okay, afterwards, he said, if you're living in a neighborhood, he said, imagine you're a black person, okay, and you go into a neighborhood and you see a bunch of, I think he said, you see KKK, members in your neighborhood, right? Or if you knew that 47% of the neighborhood were anti-black, he said, you wouldn't want to live there, okay? Like, you'd want to get the hell out of there, right? So what he was saying was, he said that in society today, and he's just talking about white people being shit on. And he said for the last 40 years or so, he says 30 to 40 years, he goes, anyone who's worked, and I'm not American, so I don't know. Okay. I know in the last 10 years, at least, it seems true. But he says that if you are a if you've worked in corporate America for the last 30 or 40 years, again, this is his hyperbole. He said every single person who's done that will know that white people have been discriminated against. And he talks about 3 or 4 cases where he was outright told, we're not going to give you a promotion because you are a white male. Okay, so he's saying that DEI or those types of, let's say, initiatives were being implicated like 30, 40 years prior. Okay. So he's basically been saying, and again, he's been very consistent in what he's been saying. He said it for years prior to making that statement. Okay, where once again, he's saying that if you go to a school, white kids are being told you're the problem, you're the cause of all this. America was built on racism. America is still as racist as it was, several hundred years ago and so on. So I do like the fact that he is pointing out how all this racism really is being fomented and is being thrust in people's faces, and that everything is seen through the lens of race. And, in cases where if there's an incident that happened that has nothing to do with race will be the first thing that's still being mentioned. Yeah. So it's very manipulative and so on. So that was what he's trying to say. And again, he's being very consistent in different areas, especially with education. And I agree on that. Okay. When we see, that so many decisions in schools, in hospitals, in politics, in law are being made on the basis of race, and when it shouldn't be. And we've talked about, race numerous times. And again, I'm not saying racism doesn't exist. I'm not saying that there's not disadvantaged groups and so on. We're not saying that, but he's saying that it's gone way overboard. And this was his way of calling it out. And again, it could have been done much better, but that was, what he's trying to do. So there's, that's my steel manning him.
Yeah, and you've basically said this, but I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't spell it out. It's just funny that he's calling out racism against whites by being racist towards blacks. Like you're not solving anything by doing the exact same thing that you're taking issue with.
And here's the thing that he always says, okay? And again, if I were black, I'd have a hard time buying it. I'd say it kind of sounds like the old, some of my best friends are black, okay? But he always says, I love black people. He says, when I talk about black people, he says, I'm not talking every single one. He says, same as when I talk about women or any other group, I'm not saying all women or all black people, okay? He says, individually, he says, I've never once in my life ever had a bad interaction with any black people ever, which I kind of find hard to believe, because how can you say that you've never in your entire life had a negative interaction? Now, if you say it wasn't based on race, fine, but say, I'm just trying to think about that, like, driving or in a shopping mall or whatever, like to say that never, ever, that seems a bit hyperbolic. But the point is, he says, I love black people all the time. And he also used to identify as black, which again, okay, for years he was saying that I identify as black because I want to be on the winning team. Again, that can be, it can be very insulting if I'm black and you go, like, you can't just do that. Okay. Like it's wrong. But because of his, let's say his self-diagnosed narcissistic tendencies, he doesn't think about how other people will see it. Even though he's so persuasive and he's always talking about how, he's so great with that, he truly doesn't think about how, an individual human who's going to hear that would feel about that. He's just thinking about the end goal. I'm trying to make this point. I'm trying to get it across. I think it'll be effective. And well, if some people get their feelings hurt or some people feel offended, too bad. Okay. And then again, I'm not justifying that. I'm just saying that that's one of his flaws. So anyway, the point being that he's claiming that he wasn't, again, criticizing any individual black person. He was just saying if that many, and again, he's saying, I'm not even blaming black people for thinking this. He's saying any group, he said this very again clearly, any group, if you're constantly being told that society is against you. And in this case, black people are constantly, starting from childhood, especially in schools, are constantly being told that you're being raised in a racist society where, the majority of people who happen to be white, they hate you. They're going to do everything in their power to hurt you, to disadvantage you, to disempower you. Okay. He's saying that if you're being told that, then how can you have any trust or affinity or any, kind of healthy relationship with those people? Or, how can you ever even feel good about yourself? How can you ever feel good about your future if you're being told you're doomed because all these people hate you? So then he just turned it on his head and said, again, that's, he used the example of, black people hating white people. Okay. He was, he's trying to not be ironic, might be the wrong word. Okay. But he's trying to, again, make the same point, but in reverse. And again, when he explains it, people go, I get that. Okay. But he could have done it in a much better way.
And I suppose to a degree, we can appreciate the fact that, he is a comedian. I mean, he did a comic that was intended to be funny, and maybe his dry humor isn't translating into these topics very clearly, but, let's maybe consider that a little bit as well. But Another thing that he has said that I really take issue with is this blanket statement that Democrats suffer from mental illness, and he can tell by looking at their eyes that they are demonic, and so on and so forth. So, okay, few things. Yes, there is certain body language that, we as clinicians are trained to recognize that can sometimes lend to either certain disorders or characteristics or behaviors or whatever the case may be. So there are definitely clues that we can glean from people's body language. But to make such a definite statement and such a broad, sweeping statement about an entire group of people, I certainly take issue with that as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, well, because I know we're coming to the end of this podcast, I think that I'll make a comment, and I think that maybe we can do another podcast where we piggyback off of this and we talk about some of the statements like that he's made that are really offending people. And again, he's doing it to be provocative. So, maybe, so if I can talk about that now, okay? Actually, you know what? I would rather talk about the fallout from what happened with that statement that he made. Okay. And then if you don't mind, we can do this, that we can answer that question, great teaser or trailer for the next podcast. And that'll be one of several provocative statements he's made, if that's okay.
Of course.
Okay. So let's just talk about the fallout after he said all that. Okay. Every single Dilbert comic, starting with, I forget which one it was. I think it was the Washington Post. Okay. They were the one, I think the main distributors of his Dilbert comic. Every single one canceled him. His publisher canceled him. Okay, everyone who had professional connections with him canceled him. So he truly was canceled, and now he's thriving more than ever before because he does have different avenues of where he can make money, and his fans support him. And now he's saying he's freer than ever. Now that he's not beholden to any media company or anyone else, he can say what he couldn't say before. So I do believe that his, that provocative statement was intended, and it seemed like he was ramping up prior to that. Okay, that he was saying like he did want to get canceled. He really did, because now he can say things that others can't. Now, he claims that he's one of the most influential people on the planet. All right, he said that if he can get 1 million people on Twitter, that then he'd be unstoppable. Again, it's the grandiosity is astounding.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, I can see that you're not a fan of it, obviously.
How could you tell?
And a lot of people are not. Okay. But you know what? He gets retweeted by Elon Musk. Vivek, Vivek has Trump has invited him to the White House. A lot of powerful people.
But if I can respond to that, yeah. I am not a fan of the statements that he makes. I don't know him as a person. Perhaps he's a lovely human being. Maybe he is. But I find it very irresponsible when people have such a huge platform and they make statements like that because they are so influential. People are going to believe what he's saying, and that is irresponsible. So that's what I take issue with. Definitely.
And again, if he's someone who understands how media works and he's so influential and persuasive and so on, he should know. Like I said, once that genie's out of the bottle, that's what people are hearing. They're not hearing all the nuance and all the other good and well-intentioned facets of his narrative. They're only hearing that one thing. So I agree with you 100%. I'm not justifying what he said at all. Again, it was poorly done. And I've seen him do this so many times with so many things. And after the fact, he's saying, voila, here's what I was doing all along. And here's how, this is my grand plan. Okay. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I agree with you. And so if people find him off-putting, yeah, I get it. I fully do. And that's why I warn my patients. It's like there was a book years ago called, I think I might have mentioned before, The Game. It was like a peek into the secret life of pickup artists. And I used to say to my patients, I say, if you can get through the crap, if you can read and just see there's some positive points, that would help you, be able to better engage with people of the opposite sex or whoever you're interested in. Okay. I said, great. Just filter out all the stuff that would make you a terrible, hateful, human being. Then that's great. So with Scott Adams, I am able to, and maybe because I'm also a white male, okay, that
there's camaraderie there.
Well, kind of like it wasn't so much the camaraderie because again, as a person, I can't stand him. I really don't. I don't like how he presents. I don't like the grandiosity. I don't like I can be hyperbolic as well, but I'm mindful of the impact that the hyperbole can have on.
But you're also tactful.
Well, that's it exactly.
Yeah.
Well, not everyone would agree, but I try to be tactful. So again, I'm able to filter out because it's not affecting me personally because I'm not one of the groups that he's targeting. That's what I meant by being the white male, not the camaraderie, but I'm not his target. Okay, that I look at what he's trying to do. And I do believe he has good intentions with trying to point out some of the ways that society, at least in the West, is being truly harmed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why in our next podcast on Scott Adams, we'll talk more about some of the points that he's raised. And we'll talk about the demonic-eyed Democrats that you mentioned. I promise you we'll talk about that in depth.
Okay. All right. So tune in next episode. We're going to continue the conversation about Scott Adams, get into some more detail about his commentary and what we think about it. And as you can expect in the next episode, we're probably not going to see eye to eye, but that's okay.
All right. And until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel.